got to fend for my sister, because my sister's 14. It is a lot of responsibility.
This is very upsetting to me. There is no amount of time that this person could get to bring back my nephew. That person will have family to come and visit her. I'll never see my nephew again.
When we first realized George was missing, I reached out to the defendant and spoke with her. She told me, she said, "Dad, I would never do anything to hurt George."
This is George Cox Sr., standing in the courtroom in front of a judge bearing his heart out about the killer of his son, his own girlfriend who had called him dad and swore she had no clue what had happened to him.
So I do regret, and I do think about it every day, that I wasn't able to help him, that I wasn't able to call the police because I panicked.
And this is Diamond Verda, his on-off girlfriend without a look of remorse on her face, explaining what she had done to George, the same person who swore she had no clue what happened to him. She is now being accused of not only taking his life, but going to horrifying lengths to make sure his body would not be found. Just a few hours after speaking to his father, George Jr. would disappear without a trace. However, George was not the kind of person who simply vanished. He was a son, and most importantly, a father to an 8-year-old daughter. The people closest to him knew something was wrong. And as the days passed without hearing from him, one person refused to stop searching. His father, George Cox Sr., a father who shared his location with George every day and always knew where he was. And the last place George's phone showed him would become the center of a disturbing investigation. George Cox Jr. was 32 years old and lived in Cleveland, Ohio. To the people who loved him, he was called June. Although he was a son, but the role that mattered most to him was being a father. George shared a close bond with his daughter, Gianna. Those who knew him described him as someone who cared deeply about his family and wanted to be present in his daughter's life. His father, George Cox Sr., was especially close to him. The two had a relationship built on constant communication. They would always check on each other. They shared their location. They always knew where the other person was. That was until George would suddenly disappear. And for his father, that silence was impossible to ignore. George had been in an on and off relationship with Diamond Vaden for approximately 4 years. Diamond was also 32 years old, and the two did not live together. George had his own apartment on Bosworth Avenue in Cleveland, while Diamond maintained her own residence. But despite living separately, Diamond remained a major part of George's life. Their relationship had its ups and downs, and by October 2024, according to George's father, his son had been thinking about walking away. It was said that George had been trying to leave the relationship and was looking for advice from someone he trusted most, his father. On October 17, 2024, George called his dad. It seemed like an ordinary conversation. He wanted to talk about a family situation. He wanted his father's opinion. George Sr. listened and gave his son advice. Then he told him to call him back later, but that phone would never come. George Sr. had no idea that conversation would become the last time he ever spoke to his son. Years later, he would still describe that moment as one of the most painful memories of his life, because a simple goodbye became permanent.
I literally spoke to him the last time on the 17th, and he was calling me, asking me questions about a family situation and asking me was he right in what he did. And we had a conversation about that, and I said, okay, well, call me later. And I never knew that would be the last time I would talk to my son.
2 days after the phone call with his father, on October 19, 2024, something happened inside George's Bosworth apartment. According to investigators, an argument between George and Diamond escalated. At some point, Diamond would attack George with a knife and injure him multiple times. She later claimed the two had been involved in a physical altercation and that the situation got out of control. But prosecutors would later argue that what happened afterward revealed something much more disturbing. Because George did not immediately lose his life. He was conscious, he was still breathing. Not only that, he was even moving through the apartment, injured and struggling. According to investigators, George was unable to reach a phone, and during that critical time, Diamond did not try to help him or call 911 either. Instead, investigators discovered searches on her phone from that night. One of those searches asked, "What are the chances to survive in real life if you get hurt in the abdomen multiple times?" To detectives, that search raised a troubling question. If George was injured and fighting for his life, why was she searching for information instead of calling for help? Why was she trying to understand his chances instead of saving him? As George's condition worsened, investigators said Diamond stayed with George inside the apartment. She did not take him to a hospital, and eventually George would die. But the nightmare was not over, because after his death, investigators said the focus shifted from the disturbance inside the apartment to a desperate attempt to hide what happened. Diamond had a sinister plan in mind. She contacted two people she knew, William Rogers and Donald Humphrey, to come to the apartment. When they arrived, they wrapped up George's lifeless body in a fitted bedsheet that had been inside the apartment. Not just that, they then tied him up with marine-style rope. After that, they drove him over 1 hour and 15 minutes from Cleveland. They had a planned destination. It was a marshy area near the Huron River in Erie County, Ohio. The plan was to dispose George's body into the river, as if his life could simply be erased, and no one would look for him. However, while Diamond and those men were carrying out their heartless plan, George's family never stopped searching. They kept calling for several days, but his phone went unanswered. His messages received no response. At this point, George's father became worried and anxious, so he made a decision to go find his son. He drove from Farmington Hills, Michigan, to Cleveland. When George Sr. arrived at the Bosworth apartment, what he saw immediately alarmed him. The apartment was empty. It looked like someone had cleared it out, but the cleanup was not perfect. There were signs that something had happened there, possible fluid stains. It seemed like someone had tried to remove traces of something that had happened. Immediately, he called the Cleveland police, and detectives responded to the apartment. Among them was Detective Callahan from the Homicide and Missing Persons Unit. Using forensic testing, investigators examined the apartment, and what they discovered confirmed the worst fears of George's family. The substance that had been cleaned from the walls, floors, and doors was human fluid, and it belonged to George Cox Jr. The apartment where George was last known to be had become a crime scene. Investigators now knew they were no longer searching for a missing person. They were investigating a possible homicide, and their attention quickly turned toward the person closest to George in Cleveland, which was Diamond Vaden. However, when detectives spoke with Diamond, she would deny knowing anything about George's disappearance. She claimed she had never been inside his apartment. That was until investigators would find something that contradicted her story. Inside Diamond's apartment, they found a pair of boots. The boots appeared to have a suspicious substance on them, but Diamond had an explanation. She told police the boots were not hers, they belonged to George. When the boots were later tested, there were remains of George's blood found on them. This was where everything began to tell a story that was very different from the one Diamond was giving investigators. But despite the growing questions, George's family was still desperate for answers. Where was George? His brother Jamari had a recorded phone conversation with Diamond. During the call, Jamari repeatedly asked about George. Diamond still denied having anything to do with his disappearance. But investigators later said her reaction during the conversation stood out. She had become angry when Jamari kept asking about George. She insisted she was not responsible for whatever that had happened to George. But behind those denials, investigators were slowly building a case, and they would make a discovery that would reveal what happened to George Cox Jr. At this point, the investigation into George Cox Jr.'s disappearance had already revealed disturbing signs. There was the blood-stained apartment, then a story that did not match the evidence, and most importantly, a person closest to George who appeared to know more than she was saying. But investigators still needed one thing. They needed to find George, because without his body, his family was trapped in the worst kind of uncertainty. They knew something terrible had likely happened, but they did not know where he was. And for 7 months, George's father refused to stop searching. After the missing person report was officially filed in November 2024, Detective Callahan took the lead on the case. With nearly 3 decades of experience in law enforcement, including years dedicated specifically to missing person investigations, he understood the pain families experience when someone disappears. Because a homicide investigation normally brings one painful truth immediately. the family knows their loved one is gone. They can begin the grieving process. But when someone is missing, there is another layer of suffering, which is hope. The possibility that maybe their loved one is still alive. For George's parents, that hope lasted for months. His father, George Sr., continued searching for answers. He had driven from Farmington Hills, Michigan, to Cleveland 26 times over the course of 7 months. Each trip was fueled by the same question: where is my son? But what George Sr. did not know was that the answer was much closer than anyone realized. Because every time he traveled to Cleveland, he had passed over the Huron River, the same river where George's remains had been dumped, where he would eventually be found. While the Cox family lived through uncertainty of where their son may be and whether he is alive or dead, Diamond Vaden continued to live her life. She even began living with another man, Emmanuel McQueen Jr. To the outside world, it appeared that she had moved on from the disappearance. But George's family was still searching, still hoping for answers. During this time, George Sr. reached out to Diamond directly. He needed information, anything that could help him understand what happened to his son. And according to George Sr., when he would give his witness statement in court, Diamond spoke to him as if nothing was wrong. She even called him Dad. She looked him in the eye, and she told him she would never do anything to hurt George. But investigators would later reveal a devastating reality. On May 16, 2025, nearly 7 months after George Cox Jr. was last heard from, 2 kayakers were traveling along the Huron River in Erie County, Ohio. When they got to a marshy section of the river, south of State Route 2, they would make a disturbing discovery. Something was floating in the water. It looked like a human body. It was wrapped in a fitted bedsheet, tied with marine-style rope. The discovery immediately raised concerns. Authorities responded to the scene, but at first, they did not know who the person was because the body had been in the river for a pretty long time, and that made it difficult to identify. However, there was something investigators could use. They released images of visible tattoos taken from the body and shared it around and asked the public for help. They believed the individual was a black male, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighing around 160 pounds, and between his 20s and mid-30s. They needed someone to recognize the tattoos, someone who could finally give this unidentified person a name. Because until they knew who he was, they could not determine what happened to him. However, the investigation into the river discovery quickly revealed one thing. This was not an accident. The way the body had been found suggested someone had intentionally tried to hide what happened. Eventually, the tattoos would give investigators a name to the identity of the person they were searching for. The body belonged to George Cox Jr. After months of uncertainty, his family finally received the answer they had been desperately waiting for. But the truth brought a different kind of pain. George had not simply disappeared. He had been taken away from them. Because of the condition of the remains, the official cause and manner of death could not be determined. Dr. Wolf, from Lucas County, conducted the examination and ruled the cause and manner as undetermined due to the decomposition. But investigators noted important findings. The circumstances surrounding the discovery suggested a non-natural death, and the police determined that George had died a disturbing death. As for the Cox family, there was finally confirmation, but there was no comfort in it. They had spent months hoping George would come home alive. Instead, they are now learning of how far someone had gone to hide him. With George identified, investigators returned their focus to Diamond Vaden. There was another piece of evidence that prosecutors would later talk about. It was a text message. On the same day investigators were continuing to build their case, Diamond had sent a message to Emmanuel McQueen Jr. The two had been arguing through text messages, and Diamond wrote, "You going to be missing next." To investigators, the message carried a disturbing implication, because they believed Diamond already knew what had happened to George. She knew someone could disappear, because she knew what had happened before. On July 21, 2025, Diamond Vaden was arrested. Authorities found her at the home she shared with her boyfriend, Emmanuel McQueen Jr. Emmanuel was also arrested at the scene because he also had another police charge on him about a weapon. Diamond was taken into custody and charged in connection with George's death. The charges included felonious assault, evidence tampering, and additional offenses related to the investigation. Prosecutors believed the evidence showed a series of choices. choices made after George was injured, choices made after he needed help, choices made to hide what happened. But Diamond's defense presented a different picture. They argued that the situation was complicated and that Diamond had reacted out of panic. Eventually, the case moved toward a plea agreement, and in the second week of March 2006, Diamond Vaden returned to court. The courtroom was now the place where George Cox Jr.'s family would finally have their voices heard. After months of uncertainty and searching, they were finally standing in front of the person responsible. Before the judge made his decision, George's loved ones stepped forward to talk about the man they lost. George's mother, Sonia Calloway, was one of the first family members to speak. She thanked the detectives and investigators who worked to find her son. But she also spoke about the reality that no amount of justice could replace what had been taken. She told the court that the tragedy never should have happened and expressed hope that another family would never have to experience the same pain. Then George's aunt, Lynette Ford, addressed the court. To her, George was more than a nephew. Although she had no children, George was like a son. She remembered the last time she saw him. On his last birthday, July 24, 2024. A moment that would become one of her final memories of him.
George Cox Jr. was my first nephew, the very first. I have no children. He was like a child to me, even though he had his parents. But the joy that I used to have with him since a little child till he was grown. Last time I saw him was on my birthday.
Lynette also went ahead to ask the judge to consider the pain the family had endured and to go beyond the terms of the plea agreement. Because, in her words, no amount of time would ever bring George back.
I want to say so many things, Your Honor, and I'm begging you to supersede whatever plea deal that you gave this person.
George Cox Sr. also stood before the court. The person who had spent 7 months searching, the father who had made countless trips between Michigan and Ohio, the father who never stopped hoping he would find his son alive. He spoke about the phone call he had with Diamond and how she had called him Dad and swore to him she would never hurt George, but all those times she knew exactly where George was and what happened to him. After the family spoke, Detective Callahan also addressed the court. After nearly 30 years in law enforcement and 15 years working missing person cases, he explained that this case affected him differently. He explained that homicide cases involving missing people create a unique type of suffering because families spend months wondering whether their loved one is still alive. For the Cox family, that period lasted 7 months. 7 months of unanswered questions. Detective Callahan also spoke about Diamond's behavior during the investigation. He told the court that he believed Diamond was a master manipulator. He pointed to the statements she made to investigators and to George's family. According to him, Diamond presented herself as someone who cared, while evidence suggested otherwise. He asked the court to impose the maximum sentence available, not only because of what happened to George, but because of what his family endured. Then it was Diamond Vaden's turn to speak. She told the court she was sorry. She said she regretted not helping George. She claimed she panicked.
And I do think about it every day that I wasn't able to help him, that I wasn't able to call the police because I panicked. I walked away from a situation that was very, 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 it was just a lot. It was a lot for me to deal with, and I truly am very, very sorry.
She described their relationship as complicated, saying it had good moments and bad moments. Diamond said she was not someone who wanted to hurt others. She expressed sympathy toward George's family and said she is still trying to process everything that had happened. Diamond Vaden had originally faced more serious charges, but as part of a negotiated plea agreement, the charge was reduced to involuntary manslaughter. She also pleaded guilty to felonious assault and another charge. The judge sentenced Diamond Vaden to 11 years for involuntary manslaughter, 8 years for felonious assault, served consecutively, and an additional 7 months for the remaining charge. The total minimum sentence was 19 years and 7 months. Under Ohio's sentencing structure, the maximum could reach 25 years and 2 months. The discovery of George's remains also created another painful decision for his family. Because of the condition of his body, George Sr. made the difficult choice to have his son cremated. He explained that the family never had the opportunity for a traditional burial. They never got the chance to say goodbye in the way they wanted. Instead, they had to face the reality of how George was found.
But we didn't even have the opportunity to properly bury him because his body was so decomposed.
This was a reality no parent should ever have to experience. For George's family, the sentence represented accountability. And one day, George Sr. knew he would have to explain to her why she could not have the goodbye she deserved. But George's story is not the only one that reveals how devastating the hidden dangers inside a relationship can become. Across the country, another family would face a similar nightmare. A loved one taken away by the very person who once promised to protect her.
Hi, my name is Kelly Native Child Mays. I am a survivor, a healer, a licensed therapist, and a poet.
But what makes Kellyanne May's story even more heartbreaking is that she was not someone who ignored the dangers of a toxic relationship. She had spent years helping others recognize the warning signs, escape painful situations, and rebuild their lives after trauma. Yet behind the strength everyone saw, Kelly was fighting a battle of her own. The same woman who encouraged others to find their courage would eventually face a devastating decision in her own marriage, because she would be found inside her Westland apartment with multiple knife wounds.
It's my sister's 14. It is a lot of responsibility.
Kellyanne Mays was born on November 21, 1974, in Detroit, Michigan. She was the youngest child of Ralph Mays and Janice Watkins Mays. Being the baby of the family, she quickly became someone everyone adored. Her sister Stacy even gave her a nickname, Twin B, a playful reminder of the special bond they shared. Kelly had compassion, determination, and strength, and those qualities followed her throughout her life. When Kelly graduated from Detroit Public Schools, she continued her education to earn a bachelor's degree in psychology at Central Michigan University. But Kelly wanted to do more when it came to her education. She later earned a master's degree in counseling from the University of Phoenix, and even after achieving that milestone, Kelly continued chasing her goals. She returned to Central Michigan University to pursue another master's degree. By 2021, she had just months to complete that degree, something she had worked years to accomplish. But sadly, Kelly would never get the opportunity to finish, because while she spent her life helping others heal, her own life was heading toward a tragedy no one saw coming. Professionally, Kelly found her purpose in mental health care. She became the community and staff training manager at Hagira Health, Inc.
Here at Hagira Health, we believe that the relationship and communication,
where she also worked as a mental health therapist. Her focus was helping children and teenagers, people who were struggling and needed someone willing to listen. To many of her clients, she was more than a therapist. However, Kelly's passion for helping survivors was from a place deeper than professional training. It came from her own experience. Years earlier, Kelly had survived a relationship that nearly destroyed her. In 2008, she was married to a man whose identity has not been widely publicized. At first, it appeared to be a relationship built on love, but over time, that relationship changed. It became controlling, manipulative, and filled with mistreatment. Then, in 2010, everything reached a breaking point. On their daughter's first birthday, an argument between Kelly and her partner became disturbing. The situation moved into a physical attack that left Kelly seriously injured. She had to be rushed to the hospital. But that moment, instead of Kelly allowing the situation to break her, she used it to change the direction of her life. Kelly ended the relationship. It was not easy, because this was a man she had been with for a long time. She really loved him and thought this would be a forever journey. However, after the breakup, she found a new purpose. She transformed her experience into a mission to help other survivors. Kelly became an outspoken advocate against domestic violence.
honest and the most real I am with myself, and it's helped me go and reach into dark places that I wouldn't otherwise be able to talk about, experiences that I wouldn't be able to talk about, and to bring them out and share them with people. It's empowered me, it's empowered other survivors to share their experiences. So definitely poetry has helped me heal. My daughters have helped me heal, because I look at them and I'm hopeful for a world without domestic violence. I know statistically that they are at risk, but I'm hopeful for them. I'm hopeful for me. I'm hopeful that these stories that I'm sharing will be a tool, a guide for them.
She shared her story publicly, speaking about survival, trauma, and the importance of recognizing abuse. She attended multiple interviews, including this one, where she spoke about how poetry became a vital part of her healing journey.
I tried to think funny, be funny, channel my inner comedian, write funny across a page, funny. Like that time I broke my arm running from a squirrel, true story. Funny, I thought it was chasing me, funny, it really wasn't funny. I still believe the squirrel apocalypse is a thing, funny. Like that time a boy called me fat. When I told him I thought he was cute. I kept the joke going, kept his homeboys laughing, kept my waistline expanding inside the punchline, hoping they wouldn't notice it really wasn't funny. At that time, I lost my wallet. I found myself at the grocery store, carts full of baby formula. Funny, the nice lady paid. Funny, I really didn't lose my wallet. Funny, I didn't have enough money to fill my car and my child's belly. Funny how life is. Keep writing, you will get to funny. Keep laughing. Laughter is the only thing that will make this poem funny. At that time, I wrote my first haiku along the wall of my college dorm. Funny. It was actually...
She performed at different poetry events with the stage name Native Child Brown. Her openness also reached wider audiences through appearances on news channels like this one, and another televised segment where she shared her story of survival and resilience.
Sadly, who is sitting back going, I don't really know how I'm going to be able to do this. How do I get the process, get the courage to move forward? What's the first step?
The first step is deciding when you're ready to leave. You know, like survivors have to decide when they're ready to leave. You can't make someone leave, you can't encourage them to leave, but at that moment when they're ready to leave.
She also took part in podcasts and community events, using her voice to reach people who felt trapped and unheard. Not only that, Kelly also had a nonprofit organization called A Survivor's Story, which she used to create spaces for survivors to find support, healing, and even hope. She was not simply talking about survival, she was living proof that someone could endure unimaginable pain and still have the courage to rebuild their life. Yet, after everything she had overcome, Kelly would face a nightmare she knew all too well. In 2015, Kelly met Jimmy Lee Brown, a 31-year-old man who appeared to be everything she had hoped for. He was a loving and supportive partner, someone who seemed ready to build a stable future with her. Jimmy was known publicly as a rapper who performed under the name Supa MC. He had even appeared in the movie 8 Mile alongside Eminem. Super MC started his journey in the Detroit music scene when he was still a teenager. People often said his mother believed in him so much that she would pull strings to get him into places like the Grand Quarters, a spot where local talent came to perform. It was there that Super MC met Proof when he was just 14 years old. Proof was holding a cipher in the bathroom, and the two went back and forth trading rhymes. From that moment, they clicked. Proof became a mentor, always pushing Super MC to sharpen his skills, and Super MC looked up to him. As he grew older, Super MC spent much of his time at the hip-hop shop, rapping alongside Detroit's rising stars, including members of D12. The hip-hop shop was the place to be if you wanted to make a name for yourself in the city, and Super MC was right in the middle of it. For those who don't know, Proof was one of Eminem's closest friends and a key member of D12. Tragically, he was shot and killed on April 11, 2006, after a dispute during a game of billiards at the CCC Club on 8 Mile Road in Detroit. He was only 32 years old. The loss hit the city hard, but Super MC was one of the artists who kept Proof's name and legacy alive through his music and dedication to the culture. If you ask people who knew Jimmy, they would tell you how charismatic and confident he seemed. Someone who maybe had overcome his past. But that past contained serious warning signs Kelly should have taken seriously. In 1993, Jimmy was convicted of using a firearm during 2 separate crimes, including an assault and an armed robbery. He was sent to prison, but was later released. Those convictions showed a history of something serious. But Kelly believed people could change. She believed in giving people second chances, and that love can overcome even the darkest past of a person. And in 2015, she married Jimmy. For a while, their relationship appeared happy. Kelly was very supportive of her husband's career. Together, they built on their two different paths of success. Jimmy even joined Kelly at different advocacy events and stood right beside her as she shared her story of survival. And as for Kelly's children, Jimmy became someone they trusted. He would attend school events, family milestones. He was the closest of a father figure they had. On social media, Kelly often shared moments that showed a loving family, memories that appear to show peace and happiness. For years, the outside world saw a couple who had built something meaningful together, a survivor who found love again, and an ex-convict who seems to be trying to not just be a better person, but trying to clean his dirty past. But behind those pictures, things were not as perfect as they appeared. In October 2020, Super MC got into a terrible car accident that nearly took his life. He fortunately survived, with his wife by his side through it all. The crash left him with a serious brain injury and memory loss, and doctors gave him only a 3% chance of ever living a normal life again, or even surviving. Against all odds, he pulled through. By October 2023, 3 years after the accident, he was still driving and continuing to rebuild his life. Things weren't the same as before, but he refused to give up. He kept working on his music, determined to make a comeback. Throughout 2023, he gave interviews and shared his testimony, telling the world how he had made it through such a devastating experience. As for his marriage, it continued to look strong, and the everyday routines gave the impression that they were solid. But as time went on, things began to change. Arguments started happening more often. The words exchanged got meaner. Kelly's children saw it all. They heard the fights, they felt the heavy atmosphere in the house. They watched their mother trying so hard to hold the family together, even as the relationship seemed like it was slipping away. The children carried the weight of it too. They worried about their mom. They wanted peace, and eventually, they found the courage to speak up. They begged her to leave Jimmy. This was not a situation that was new to them. It had happened before, and they know how it had ended. They wanted her safe and happy. More than anything, they wanted their mother to have the life she deserved. But leaving an unhealthy relationship is not always simple. Kelly understood that better than most. She had spent years helping other survivors find their strength. Yet now she found herself facing the same difficult decision. She stayed because she hoped things could improve. She stayed because of the family they had built. She stayed because she remembered the person Jimmy had been before things turned sour. But slowly, Kelly began realizing something. She could not continue living this way, and by the beginning of 2024, she finally made a decision that would change everything. Kelly had spent years telling other women that they deserved safety, that they deserved peace, that they deserved a life free from fear. Now, she had to follow her own advice. Just like George had decided to finally end things with Diamond, Kelly too decided she was leaving Jimmy. She told him she wanted to end the marriage. For Kelly, this was not an impulsive choice. It was the result of years of emotional struggle, years of trying to make things work with the hope that things would change. When she finally told Jimmy, the conversation initially appeared calm. There was no explosive argument, no immediate confrontation. They sat down like mature adults and discussed other important things. The children, their responsibilities. It appeared like they might separate peacefully, but investigators would later believe something much darker was happening beneath the surface. Because while Kelly believed she was moving toward freedom, Jimmy was busy planning a deadly revenge. As the days passed, Jimmy's behavior began to change. The same man who had appeared to accept Kelly's decision was now struggling to accept the reality of losing control over the relationship and over Kelly. What Kelly saw as a necessary step toward protecting herself, Jimmy viewed as a betrayal, and behind closed doors, his anger continued to grow. Kelly had spent years helping survivors recognize warning signs. She knew that leaving an abusive relationship could be one of the most dangerous moments for a victim, but even with all her knowledge and experience, she could not have predicted how quickly her own situation would turn deadly. Because the person she once believed would support her new beginning would soon become the person accused of ending her life. On the morning of January 7, 2024, Kelly's daughter Celeste had returned to their apartment on McKinney Drive in Westland, Michigan. And first, nothing seemed unusual. The home looked the same. Her mother's belongings were still there, everything appeared normal. But something felt wrong. The apartment was quiet, maybe even too quiet. Celeste called out for her mother, hoping for a response. But there was no response. As she moved through the apartment, the feeling that something was terribly wrong became stronger. Then she reached the bedroom, and that was where she found her mother, Kellyanne Mays, was lying on the floor, surrounded by... The scene was something no daughter should ever have to witness. Kelly had been attacked with a knife multiple times, including injuries to her neck and chest. Celeste was in shock and disbelief. She immediately reached for her mother, hoping there was still a chance, hoping she was wrong, but her mom's foot was cold. The reality quickly became clear. Kelly was gone. Celeste immediately called 911, and within moments, the Westland police officers were on their way. When they arrived at the apartment, they were met with a scene straight from a horror movie. There were 17 stab wounds on her. Whoever was responsible for causing such a gruesome scene really wanted Kelly not to survive. Investigators began documenting what they found. One thing they found that was suspicious was that there were no obvious signs of a break-in, no evidence that a stranger had forced their way inside. The circumstances pointed towards someone Kelly knew, someone who had access to her home, someone who obviously knew her routine. As detectives began looking into the people closest to Kelly, one name quickly stood out: Jimmy Lee Brown, the husband she had recently decided to leave, the man with a history of violence. The man who had the strongest possible motive may want her gone. But before police could begin searching for him, something unexpected happened. Jimmy walked into the Westland Police Department himself. He surrendered. There was no chase, no attempt to hide or struggle with officers. The same man investigators suspected was responsible for Kelly's death had voluntarily placed himself in police custody. But his decision to surrender did not answer the most important questions. Why did Kelly have to die? And what happened inside that apartment before her daughter found her? On January 8, 2024, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office officially charged Jimmy Lee Brown with first-degree murder in connection with Kelly's death. The case immediately drew public attention, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of who Kelly was. She was not just another victim. She was someone who had dedicated her life to helping survivors of domestic violence, someone who had encouraged others to find their voice, someone who had spent years telling people that they deserved better. And now, her own story has become a devastating example of the dangers many survivors face. Despite the seriousness of the charges, Jimmy did not take the case to trial. Instead, he entered a guilty plea. He admitted responsibility for Kelly's death by pleading guilty to second-degree murder. During the hearing, he expressed remorse for what happened. But for Kelly's loved ones, an apology could never undo the loss. Nothing could bring back the woman who had spent her life helping others. Nothing could erase the image of how she was found. And nothing could restore the future that had been taken away. On March 10, 2025, more than a year after Kelly's death, Jimmy Lee Brown was sentenced to 18 to 40 years in prison. Under the sentence, he would have to serve at least 18 years before becoming eligible for parole. The punishment brought a legal conclusion to the case. But for Kelly's family, justice was not the same as closure, because closure would mean having Kelly back. It would mean hearing her voice again, seeing her smile, watching her continue the work she loved, and that was something no courtroom could provide. Kelly's daughters were among those who suffered the greatest loss. The two young women who once looked to their mother for guidance were now forced to navigate life without her. Her father, Ralph Mays, also expressed how much hurt he felt for losing his daughter. He spoke about how she had done everything a parent would want from a child.
She's done everything a parent would want a kid to do. I mean, she did it all right.
Went to school, got straight A's, earned 2 master's degrees, loved the Detroit Lions, and was an advocate for domestic abuse survivors.
Kelly's story challenged the idea that only certain people can become victims. Kelly was educated. She was experienced in counseling. She understood the warning signs. She had helped countless survivors recognize dangerous situations. Yet even she found herself trapped in a relationship that became increasingly difficult and dangerous. Her death showed that knowledge and strength do not make someone immune from harm. George Cox Jr. and Kellyanne Mays lived different lives, but their stories ended with a heartbreaking similarity. The people they trusted the most became the ones accused of taking their lives.